Hello and welcome back to Tech TV. Today we're going to be looking at some of the latest highlights on what's happening in the market with a big news roundup, and almost everything at the moment is touching on AI in one way or another. We're starting with a story about the fact that the investment, as everyone has seen, has been absolutely fantastic in various different data centers around the world, but a lot of that is starting to get real with a lot of the ecosystem players, such here as Four Systems, becoming a unicorn almost overnight as its liquid cooling technology becomes a big bet for the technology firms themselves, showing that a lot of this investment, be it too much, too little, or whatever, is actually going ahead. Now, Pete, this is bringing us on to talk a little bit about exactly where we are with some of the big news stories at the moment. Another I know that has been an area of focus has been around Anthropic. Tell me a little bit about what Anthropic has been up to and how its relationship with the Department of Defense is.
Well, this has been years in the making, Phil. It's really actually quite predictable if you think about human nature. When AI started, people said, right, we're not going to use this wonderful new technology for doing horrible things like killing people. We're going to have a human in the loop. We can't have killer robots. And there are all these terrible tabloid stories saying that these were going to be developed. There was meant to be this ethical debate. And in fact, it's going on even now, because in Geneva, as we speak, they're debating whether we should have killer robots. Whether the President of the United States would listen to the United Nations or not is very much a controversial point. So what's happening is the Pentagon have said that they want to use Anthropic essentially to target the people that it wants to fire missiles at. Anthropic have said, no, we don't want you to, because we want to be ethical about this. And a lot of other AI companies have seen the opportunity to dive in and perhaps get some lucrative defense contracts. So now the result of that was that the Pentagon rounded on Anthropic, said it was going to cut it out of its supply chains, and that would have an impact on its business. So, and that's very, very relevant to what we're going to be talking about in a minute, which is essentially the capitalization of AI and how you're going to make AI make money. But it's a very, very important issue, and it's one that has slid since over a year ago, when at the end of the Munich Security Summit, Peter Hegseth, J.D. Vance said that the world should get over this ethical debate about AI, and we should just let it develop so that it could make money. And this has become an underlying theme of the Trump presidency that I think we're going to have to really think about very, very seriously.
But not all companies have come out in order to either be against Anthropic. I know that OpenAI stepped into their shoes in the Department of Defense deal and were willing to compromise their values in a way that Anthropic weren't. But many of the other mainstays in the technology industry have all come out and supported Anthropic. We've seen Microsoft and a whole host of other big technology firms and a large number of generals and former Department of Defense staff come out very vociferous about the fact that the ban they're talking about, which is a supply chain risk designation and something that's only ever been used with Kaspersky or with Chinese firms in the past like Huawei, is a step too far when we're talking about a key technology provider within the US AI market. Anyway, that's obviously a story that we're going to be following and that we're going to be taking forward a lot further. But bringing us on to our special topic today, we've started to see some big moves in the market around the threat that AI pays to software in general. The idea that there's going to be a SaaS apocalypse and there's going to be a massive sell-off in the value of a lot of the big software companies, and we've seen a fresh wave of selling recently. This comes us on to the discussion about, well, what is happening in the markets? Are we overinvested in AI? And Pete, we've got a special guest here today. Tell us a little bit about who's come to join us.
Well, it's James Cobb. James is a former Wall Street broker and is extremely concerned about the development of AI. He's also a technology expert, and he's had the foresight to actually start up a battery company, which is delivering batteries all across the world, because James knows, he's on the inside track there. He knows that you're going to need to actually put energy in batteries to actually get some backup. So, hello, James.
Hi all, hi Pete, hi Bill.
James, thank you so much for joining us. Now, there are predictions that there is going to be some sort of massive market correction, maybe a big downturn, and that a lot of the venture capitalists are overextended. Explain to our readers who might not be as familiar with the situation where we are with the venture capital market and a lot of the private equity firms, especially in relation to AI and software.
So maybe I can take this a bit. I mean, we all know there's like AI frenzy, and the market for the past, I think, 3 months had really, began really putting down the money. Meaning like the selling has really picked up over the last 3 months. It's cementing on the AI overinvestment that everybody's been talking about. And I guess we are kind of at a stage where all that talk about overinvesting, we're now getting kind of to the point where it's the selling has started. The circular financing is getting to the point where it's beginning to be unwound. Instead of going through the entire overinvestment, I think this is like, from a market point of view, this is already an old story. I guess more specifically, we can talk about what's happening to pretty much the oxygen. Like, how do you keep the investment ongoing? The oxygen, the financing within the system, how that's beginning to break down.
James, in terms of that, when you say it's an old story, I mean, let's just take two things. One, overinvestment. There is over 50% of the available capital in the world at the moment is speculating on AI, and I'm sure that figure changes. However, what you're saying is that it's the underlying calculations on all of this that are actually creating the problem. You're saying that you cannot actually deliver the money back for the investment, and that's why this market uncertainty has started to occur, isn't it? That's what you're saying. You're saying the sums don't add up at the moment.
That's correct. The math doesn't really add up. And to be honest, that's really not a driver for investment. I mean, there have been, in history, many instances where the math of the underlying investment doesn't add up. But as long as there's credit available, there's money behind that, this is the greater fool theory. In the beginning, you're smart for getting into something that's early. But as it progresses, obviously, the investment return diminishes. But people kept investing because there was somebody to offload it to. I think in the AI, we are pretty much at a point where everybody knows where the mathematics is. The investment returns, we still have not, for example, OpenAI has not been able to figure out how to make money yet. They have a bunch of capital commitments and they cannot show a return. But as long as people are willing to invest, and this is where, as long as credit is available, it keeps expanding, and people keep thinking it's a good idea. It's not the first time we've seen it in history. So, but the interesting is how fast this is being unwound. And the very last piece almost of this kind of like very old story is the public sector, is the individual investors. So obviously, where you want to look, where you want to look for where the system is breaking is where's that capital coming from? And this is, I think, the gated funds or the out credit or the investment that individual mom and pop investors putting into these Wall Street firms, and those money is going to air, unbeknownst to probably the mom and pop. They are the one that's getting unwound, and those are the sell-offs that you start to see that will really affect how this investment bubble get unwound.
So, in the past, we've had private equity firms that have specialized in making investments, turning companies around, possibly making them more efficient, selling off parts of the business that weren't core to the business. And that has been the model for a lot of these private equity firms. More recently, there have been fewer and fewer sort of conglomerates or bloated firms for them to focus on. And instead, they've gone all in on a big bet around AI. Now, we've seen recently that some of this is starting to unwind a little bit, and that we're seeing that with big funds like Morgan Stanley and BlackRock have reached a position where concerns as such and attempts to withdraw money have meant that they've had to limit withdrawals. What is the role that private equity and venture capital are playing here? What is the risk of a larger systemic impact?
So this is where it's kind of important. I like the history that you brought up about private equity in terms of making energy more efficient. I think this is a story, or this is the field that private equity started to play in the 1980s, where it really kind of picked up because it's tax efficient. But I want to compare that what began in the 80s to what's happening now. The scale of it is completely different. And one of the ways that's different is that private equity never borrow money from mom and pop. They never went to the stock market to raise billions of dollars, meaning somebody who can trade in the stock market cannot get into a corporate takeover or making these companies leaner. But in this case, mom and pop investors, the general stock market, are able to put into these private equity funds. But however, they're only private equity in name only, because they're private equity, but they have a publicly listed shares. People invest in them, and they go around investing this very illiquid, very hard to value assets that for currently does not make a return. And these are the AI infrastructure, the core weave ultimately goes to Oracle and ultimately goes to firms like OpenAI. And that's kind of the system that's breaking. And again, it's very important to distinguish between what private equity meant to do, started in the 80s, how they were private, very sophisticated institutional investor, an individual investor, where the deal does not go into billions. And here you have tens or even hundreds of billions of public money that non-sophisticated investors can get in, and they often are buying something that's really illiquid.
Why are people being sucked into this? I mean, what you're saying is that these, perhaps, let's call them not particularly sophisticated investors, they've invested in an entity. You've got the sophisticated investors who are the entity who are deciding where that money will be going. Is it that so much money has been invested into AI at the moment that there cannot be a failure, that we can't afford to see it fail, because if so, there will be an implosion?
Well, I think there's two different questions here. I'll address the first one, being the sophisticated why are people so stuck into this? I guess unlike the corporate raider story, or rather the making company more lenient story that you have started from the 80s. This story, I guess, the investment's almost its own marketing tools, right? I mean, like we all use ChatGPT, we also use generative AI, we saw how special it is. So I guess it's almost foreseeable that private equity firm that usually invest in these illiquid long-term deals, that they would naturally gravitate toward public listings. So from that perspective, we kind of, we know where the motivation is. I guess sorry, I forgot, Pete, I forgot your second part of your question.
Well, what I was saying was that these entities, these very sophisticated investment companies, they've committed a lot of their funds already. They must commit more funds, because otherwise the bubble will burst. They can't afford the bubble to burst. Is it that everybody is being sucked into a system where we cannot fail?
That's correct. So your question here, the second part, is whether this problem is systemic. Having personally gone through a few economic cycle and kind of participated, deeply involved in the last credit bubble, I think it's almost a foregone conclusion that this is a systemic issue. I think if you look at the composition of big tech and AI investment in terms of GDP growth and how much investment that the Western world, actually not just Western world, the entire world is investing into AI, how much of our economic activities depends on it. I think it's almost a foregone conclusion that this will affect a lot of downstream, a lot of this, what economists call the credit generation. The entire economy, just remember, is based on credit creation. It's not really creation of money. It's purely dependent on, are there more investment available that will pay back the previous one? And so if you allocate so much of your GDP, so much of your current investment in AI, and if that train, sorry to use that term, Ponzi scheme, like stops, then you really have you have a potential systemic collapse.
That was the issue that I was actually going to bring up. Sorry, Bill.
But there are signs that the train's starting to come off the rails. I mean, we're starting to see the fact that the big companies, Amazon, Oracle, and others that are meant to be investing so heavily in AI are actually struggling with their AI commitments, and they're actually resorting to layoffs. And especially in the case of somewhere like Oracle, which was a high margin software business, it's struggling to come to a realization that all of a sudden it's a low margin infrastructure business with a massive amount of capital risk invested in a particular project with OpenAI that, if it goes wrong, could be terminal for Oracle. But also, if OpenAI were to collapse because of the cross investment between all the different firms, it would have systemic implications. Are we looking at a situation where there is real concern that the wheels are going to come off at this point in time, or are we okay?
So I personally think it's the latter. To be honest, at this stage, in terms of the massive layoff that being planned, again, these are preemptive. I think it's correct that the technology firms, or the people that going in this merry-go-round of AI circular investments, do realize this, and now they have announced almost preemptively to the market they're going to announce something ridiculous like 20% of their staff, just because they now admitted that they have over-invested, meaning they're rather put financial contract over people. So you really have this unwinding that happens in, it's kind of the Great Recession or the credit crisis on steroids. This happened very, very quickly in terms of the overinvestment. And it seems like the unwinding could happen rather quickly. If we remember correctly, back in 2007, 2008, there was a period where the market doesn't really know where it's going because mortgages kind of was very difficult to value, and you have a few players kind of that owns it, and a lot of the risk was offloaded to foreign entities that are these sophisticated investors. But this time we're not seeing them. So, and then this risk is intertwined into the stock market, into people's retirement, into savings, into the general markets. So that's a real concern that what the tech company is currently doing is just preempting what they will do. And because this length is so circular, everyone's kind of need each other to cook each other's books. Sorry again to use those terms, but it's hard to talk about this kind of interdependent financing without really talking about fraud, because every time we have these bubbles, when we look into that financial record, into the accounting, there are people borrowing each other, just inflating each other's figures, and AI is very much a classic example of one.
And again, I mean, many people have said that. Many people have made this analogy to a serpent eating its tail and called about these various different ways where one company is inflating the share price of another deliberately to actually get investment in other areas, which brings us quite nicely onto the other thing that we wanted to talk about, which is infrastructure. Because one of the things about this investment, James, is that in a sense, we're talking about a world that we don't really know, that is under development. President Trump had announced the investment of $500 billion in a Stargate project. Now, that figure in itself is quite controversial because exactly what that money is and where it comes from is quite controversial. But underpinning this idea about these new data centers that will power AI, the data centers themselves are almost in quite a fluid state, aren't they? Because, for example, people are talking about gigawatt data centers. And if you apply all of those to the current electrical model, there isn't enough electricity in the grid. So we have to build even more infrastructure to even get to some of the points that people are currently speculating on, don't we?
So that's correct. I think, Pete, you and I were talking about, because I started working on this piece in the beginning of the year about this piece called the anatomy of death. It's basically talking about the autopsy, rather the mechanism of how all these financing in AI fails. And one of the first things I pointed out is the thermodynamic nature of failure. Like, it's really this, your energy equation does not make sense. And you exactly point to that. In order to have the kind of AI, revolution that we're talking about, this huge upscaling of intelligence from a nation state point of view, you need energy infrastructure. And when you hear politicians and people that build them talking about building energy infrastructure while they have already committed this build up, and this is when you realize they just fundamentally doesn't know the first, second, or third law of their own dynamics, that actually there's not enough energy infrastructure to scale up the way they scale it. And if you were to do it, I think the United States and Europe will be the last place to do it, because they just don't have the modern energy infrastructure to do that. And even that, I would argue that the informational infrastructure, the data transfer infrastructure, is also not there. So that's a multiple. Yeah, people like to talk about and the article focused on the anatomy of how they financially get unwound, and that's the interesting bit. But that's an even more fundamental bit that I personally call on. This is the thermodynamic, the energy equation failure of this entire Stargate project.
It's not. There's energy, there's water, there's cooling. And one of the things that is really incredible about what's going on at the moment is that everybody's talking about AI as though it's a done deal. Everybody's talking about it as though it's a finished technology. We're at the equivalent stage of the Stockholm-Darlington Railway. I think it was about 1825, where we've got these sort of very, very crude vehicles that are testing out on the railway tracks, aren't we? I mean, AI is nowhere near finished. This is just the start.
That's absolutely right. So I'm kind of lucky enough to be, early in my education. I understand the mathematics or the nature of AI very early on, where I did my graduate study in New York. And what you realize the last, let's say, 5 years, that not only is the technology moving very, very quickly, and when you call it technology, it's kind of funny. We kind of think of technology as like machinery. But the technology that's moving here is actually not machinery, it's mathematics, and actually the understanding mathematics. And it's actually not the mathematics of physics we like to think. It's actually the mathematics of psychology. And that's moving very, very quickly because people, is beginning to understand the biology, the intelligence of the biological systems. When you put mathematics on top of that, we're able to create something, we get something that's akin to human intelligence. And it turns out that while OpenAI gave us this really beautiful visual representation of intelligence, they were only months, 1 year, and right now probably only months ahead of everybody else. And I think it's very much in the last 3 months, it's kind of, at least in the AI, in the inner circle of AI, the expert AI, they all thought OpenAI and all these cutting edge model is not really that cutting edge anymore. We are moving so quickly, and then the mathematical models, rather the way we approach this mathematical formula towards intelligence is very much more near to each other. And it's just, and again, this has something to do with that this technology is not moving in a physical lab, a physical factory, is actually moving on a piece of paper and understanding of psychology. In this case, human cognitive science.
Bill.
Well, thank you very much, James. This has been enlightening. So really to move on and to sort of wrap up and whatever, we want to talk on a little bit of a more light-hearted note. We've been looking at stories around, and a lot of people have been using AI to entertain their children, and there's a concern that AI really doesn't respond appropriately to children and possibly misreads their emotions. You could also argue that there are many new parents and people who are unfamiliar with children who are equally inappropriate or unused to children. But more than that, we're also looking at a story where we've got a campaign now to have an emblem that symbolizes products that are human made and therefore are actually AI free. Maybe this is a backlash to some of the tat and the slop that exists on the internet at the moment. Pete, I wonder, what's your thoughts in terms of having an AI free environment? Is this a campaign or an area where we should be focused?
I think we should. I genuinely think we should. Some people claim, for example, I write poetry, and I like art. People are claiming that AI can produce human art, and or they also claim it can produce human poetry. It can't. It can't, because if an AI system writes a poem about love, then it's essentially a fraud, isn't it? Because the AI system doesn't love you. It's just being told to write something that says it loves you. It doesn't have any comprehension of the term love. In fact, it doesn't have any comprehension. So I think having a symbol that says there's no AI in this is a good idea. I also think, though, that this is almost symptomatic of everything that we've been talking about. It's been quite interesting, this program, because everything's so circular. We're talking about, should we have AIs killing people? Because, they can't feel the blood, they can't feel the death, they can't feel the pain. Should we have them loving each other? I think it's absolutely, totally appropriate. Because as James had said, we're talking about a psychology here, and there seems to be some psychological process that is being perpetrated on humanity, which is essentially telling them lies, telling them fibs about how the technology works. I mean, James, you've got to back that. You've got to say that we need to get this technology in proportion.
No, absolutely. I think I think last time we talked about you don't really, artificial intelligence does us no good if artificial is meant to replicate human intelligence. It doesn't do us any good if the things above human intelligence, which is institutional intelligence, the intelligence of the government system, of our hospital, of our legal system, and also we have this international body that's supposed to keep war and peace. If those intelligence fails, you can throw more AI, more human intelligence. We get us into trouble, and which is actually, I feel like this is the time that we kind of live in right now. Is so dangerous. Is AI is akin to a nuclear weapons, because not so much that the intelligence is bad, it is that we have a layer above us that's supposed to protect us. That institutional intelligence, or whether institutional stupidity, is AI is this AI intelligence is making it a lot worse. This doesn't actually help us in any way. When your institution, the rule and regulation that we would regard ourselves, those guardrails is completely broken. I guess I take a more nuanced perspective that if we don't get our institutional intelligence right, we can throw more human intelligence or artificial intelligence, whatever you want. It doesn't really do anything. It's just exaggerate the situation.
Which brings us very, very neatly around to this thing about Anthropic, AI. What we have to decide is where we are actually going to have AI, where it's appropriate for it. And this headlong rush that we've currently been having, where people have been trying to make as much money as they possibly can from it, Honestly, I mean, it strikes me that the perspective is needed. I don't think that it's appropriate for parents to abnegate their responsibility by saying, no, here you go, here's an AI kit, here's an AI pod that you can play with. And I want you to do that so I can go off and do something else myself. We've actually got to take responsibility. I think that's what we're really saying in overview. James, this has actually been fascinating. I mean, the fact that it is so circular, that you can actually go from one bit at the beginning round to a discussion about the fact that the economics of it isn't working, and then there's a bit of a feeling that we haven't really got this in perspective. It's been genuinely interesting. Right now, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you also, everybody, for joining us. Thank you for this coming into this episode of Heads Up, and we'll be back with you shortly. Hopefully, we'll be able to come up with some much better news that actually demonstrates that we've become very intelligent and that artificial intelligence is actually augmenting our intelligence, and we've developed that higher level that James is talking about. We'll look forward to that.
Thank you, everyone.